And you have an international background, as I saw, in making, teaching, research, and curating. And you like to experiment with how design can be used as a tool for critical thinking, speculation, fiction, social engagement, and of course for radical change and decolonization. These last 4 years, you were director of Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum in Tromsø, and have been working much to figure out how, I really love this, how much more punk rock the basic outlook could be in the ways of being and living in museums. And I also read that you sometimes remember that you have a PhD in art history and theory, and that you can do the whole doctor thing when needed. And I do hope you don't need to do the doctor thing, because I'm really looking forward to the punk rock practical ideas and tips that you have, and the toolkit, the do-it-yourself toolkit. So, Jérémie, your stage, and I'm going to lock myself out.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that very warm and kind, generous introduction. And thanks to all of you that have chosen to tune in here. I'm sort of going to test out something here, because that sort of plays into the whole idea about trying to be a bit experimental. And there's an option to do polls in this interface we have that I've not been in any sessions that it's been done yet, but we're going to do some rapid fire polls very quick that you're not meant to think at all about. You're just meant to answer quickly, and then I close it and we open the next one. So here goes poll number 1. And I hope that works for all of you. Great. So I'm going to close the poll down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to close that poll, and then we'll open up another one. I'm going to hit you with some quick fire questions here. So here's a new poll to respond to. And don't overthink these things, and think in terms of an institutional context as well. Maybe in your work life, not your entire life. Great, I'm going to close this down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There, and then we'll have one last poll for now, and we'll maybe come back to a final poll closer to the end. So opening up this third poll, if you can answer that as quickly as possible. Great, and then we'll close that down as well now in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off. Okay, I think I'm able to share the results with all of you guys. Let's see if that works. Is that, I don't know. Can someone chime in there and tell me if you guys see the results?
We can't see results.
Well, I
can't see them.
Okay, I've clicked on sort of share, but okay. Well, we'll say I'll share the results then. For the first one, what do you need right now? 77.8% wanted inspiration. Nobody wanted lunch or coffee. 11% wanted provocation, and 2 people wanted something else. So we'll go for inspiration mixed with provocation and a wee pinch of something else in this session. In terms of the other poll, what do you need to make change happen? The majority of you replied with vision, followed by time and money. So that's nice that we have a vision heavy grouping of people here. And then I'm really interested to see what you guys think is in your way. Something else took the majority in what's in your way, followed closely by your boss, which is something I expected, at least from the museum sector. That's something I hear from a lot of curators and workers in museums, that it's often an idea of a boss being in your way. Okay, so thanks for participating in that. That gives us maybe a bit of a common starting point. And I'll see what we can do if we come back to those, or maybe some of you guys can chime in a bit in the chat function and say especially what these something else's might be, because it's anybody's guess what that might be, but could be interesting to hear. I'm going to go ahead and open up then my presentation for you guys and get that up on the screen. And that's going to be, I'm going to try to talk through a number of issues rather quickly. I've given the title of this presentation, it's Change Now, and I've called this a Do-It-Yourself Toolkit for Cultural Institutions. It's probably useful to sort of place myself. I'm coming from a design background as both a practitioner, sort of critical practitioner, and also a sort of by default, a museum director in the past few years. So somebody who, in a sense, a bit became a museum director, it came into the museum world and had a rather quick rise up to leadership position, but had never thought that I would actually be working in museums. And I think what I was basically doing in retrospect was pretending to be a director while actually being a designer, and using the museum, in fact, as a medium for design practice. And that's sort of a perspective that I want to share with you guys. So maybe some of you are working in other types of cultural institutions as well. And what I hope I can give you guys as a major takeaway is this sense of using experimental, even radical, speculative thinking as a driver for leading cultural institutions and making change. So that the key takeaway I want to give is this concept of rapid prototyping, or the rapid prototype. If some of you were in the earlier session today about design thinking, then this was covered a bit. I'm talking about something slightly different. I'm hijacking or slightly putting the idea of a prototype from the design thinking on a bit of a detour, and making it more experimental and more hands-on, and a sort of live testing idea at the scale of cultural institutions, in which we are trying to be fearless, being speculative, getting messy, and learning through doing as a sort of live act, so that we use our institutions to test drive new ideas and new versions of ourselves. So what I want to propose is this sort of, from my own practice while leading the Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, or Northern Norway Art Museum in Tromsø in the north of Norway. We did 3 rather radical transformative projects in the course of 3 years. And this was an attempt to both remake ourselves as a different type of institution, both in our ways of doing, seeing, behaving, interacting with our local community, but also in terms of testing the ideas that, for example, museums are slow-moving, ponderous things, or that museums are difficult to change. So sort of questioning these things. And just a quick map for all of you to place me a bit in the world and where I'm speaking from. This is a map showing the current nation states of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, with the indigenous territory of Sápmi, which is the lands of the indigenous Sami, mapped on top of that. And then I'm placed there up in the north in Tromsø, or Romsa in Sami, North Sami language. So I'm going to talk through these 3 quick projects very quickly, and then move on to a sort of, 4 small mini sort of toolkits or tools. I hope that some of you out there might be inspired or provoked to maybe use and test out in your own setting and context. So project 1 is a project called Sami Daida Musea, which translates as Sami Art Museum. This is a project that I pioneered back in 2017 together with a partner Sami institution, and it basically worked like this, that we had this institution, the one I was running, Northern Norway Art Museum, which is an institution that's a bit over 30 years old and had been managing to more or less exclude or ignore Sami art and art practices, and indeed Sami culture at large, for the course of its existence. And for me, this was a deeply colonial problem, and something that I was either going to be a part of the problem or I was going to do something about it and try to make change. So what we did together with Sami artists and the partner Sami institution, this institution, Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, disappeared completely and without warning overnight, and transformed, re-emerged the next day as Sami Daida Museum or Sami Art Museum, complete with a completely new branding, graphic identity in terms of signage, exterior facade, and all sorts of other things, an entirely different collection of art on view, a set of museum ephemera, sorry, that went the wrong way, such as t-shirts, like the one I am still wearing today, buttons, business cards, press releases, letterhead, and the like, as well as a series of digital platforms, such as a website, Facebook accounts, etc. And all of this, again, as I said, was done overnight and with no prior warning to the press or the general public. And the time frame for this project, from sort of idea through to implementation, was about 3 months total in time. Just to give you an idea of this idea of trying to work rapidly and very agile and on our feet. So that project was a way of both opening up a space to talk about cultural politics in the Nordic countries, in Norway and the Nordics, in terms of a exclusion of indigenous voices and indigenous presence in art and cultural institutions, and also a way to decolonize or transform Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, so that the lasting impact of this project was, for example, the use of Sami language throughout all of the museum signage going forward and content in exhibitions, regardless of what was being shown, changes to staffing in terms of recruitment and who's working at the museum and whose voices are being heard, and a lot of other things, knockdown effects like that. So that was rapid transformation number one. Transformation number two in the second year is a project called Like Betsy, which was taking as a starting point the work of a historical woman artist, Betsy Akersluit-Berg, who was active as a sort of seascape and landscape painter in the 1800s, later 1800s, early 1900s. And as we know, art museums, many art museums around the world, not only do they have problems in terms of representation when it comes to indigenous peoples and people of color, there are also major issues to do with gender representation and gender imbalance that art museums do a very good job of talking about all the time, but not necessarily doing anything about it. So this was an experiment. This project was an experiment in how to sort of engage, particularly in the Nordic countries, which have a self-identity of being very gender balanced and equal, how to engage, how to problematize that sort of self-mythology, and also how to be a more activist outreach public institution. So taking as a starting point this landscape painting, historical painting, and thinking, how can we as an institution do something rather different? How can we be an activist, self-critical institution and open up new spaces for dialogue and exchange with our audiences? So you'll notice a sort of piece of paper taped onto the wall below the left corner of this painting. And this is an idea of sort of self-hacking or being self-critical and being honest with the public. So for example, this, rudimentary way of questioning ourselves and questioning the museum and being honest with the public about that, this painting. So yes, we are now highlighting this woman and trying to write Betsy Akersluit-Berg back into the history of Norwegian art or European art more generally. But it is, the starting point has to be self-critical, that this is the only artwork by this woman in the entire collection. And mimicking that also with broader debates in the art world in terms of gross misrepresentation of women in in most museums and galleries around the world, huge discrepancies in pay and the like. So creating a sort of feminist killjoy type of tactic where the experience of viewing art was no longer as benign or easy as maybe some members of the public would like or would be used to. So you're confronted with contemporary facts about gender inequality while viewing historical images by a female artist. This project also moved in a different direction, which was perhaps the more prototype version of how to be an activist museum, taking as a starting point archival imagery we had, which showed the artist Betsy Åkerslutberg traveling around with this wooden case that she would use as a sort of protection device to paint in while out in nature, and using that as a starting point to do a series of interventions in public space, such as right outside our museum in a public park, and more or less hacking or modifying monuments in public space, monuments to men, of course, to Norwegian heroes. And this was before the whole statue debate kicked off connected to Black Lives Matter. So we were a museum that engaged the city of Tromsø and other towns in northern Norway as well by hacking other statues in this way. And it created quite a lot of debate, including calls for me to be imprisoned for life because we were allegedly vandalizing statues and so forth. So this really opened up a new way of being an activist institution that created all sorts of new relationships with our public and politics. I know this is going fast, but I hope it works for you guys and you'll bear with me. The third project was a headquarters for craftivism. So this was the third in the 3-year run of doing sort of total transformations of the museum. And this was the idea of creating a new space which would privilege, I guess, building on the sort of indigenous critique of the first project and the gender critique of the second project, to focus on an overall new version of the museum as a headquarters for craft or headquarters for craftivism, which would start sharing in a very radical way the ideas of authorship and ownership and expertise with our public. So this was both a physical sort of modification of the museum. So again, as in the Sami Daida Museum project, a change to the logo and also the name of the museum. So here you see new signage coming into place. Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum gets sort of hacked or gently changed to Nordnorsk Kunsthåndverksmuseum, which translates as Northern Norway Art Museum, transforming into Northern Norway Handicraft Museum. So both that change as well as the change across the board in digital platforms as well, the sort of gentle changing of the logo, maybe not taking ourselves too seriously, and then starting to push that idea to see who are actually now the curators and people engaging with our art and arranging our installations. Daycare or kindergarten children can also be given space and be experts and authors or co-authors of works that are on display. And a key issue here, because this again was a project carried out in a very short amount of time, a sort of total makeover of our museum spaces, done in large part by the museum staff themselves, myself included. So doing a lot of the painting work, the reconstruction work, the sort of the literal knocking down of walls, which of course was a metaphor for also the conceptual opening up and removal of walls to create an entirely new sort of space where publics are making and creating work themselves to interact with their community and share with one another. So that's the sort of rapid fire sort of ways in which I employed design thinking and experimental practice to really drive transformation at a rapid pace in the context of an art museum. And what I want to do very quickly in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to try to wrap up in about 2 or 3 minutes so we have ample time for discussion, is to share with you 4 quick ideation exercises. That's a term from design, but 4 quick exercises that I hope some of you might be inspired to try out in your own context and see what that might generate or come up with. So again, I'm working in a museum context, and particularly with issues of indigenous voice, indigenizing and decolonizing, but you'll have to identify your own problems and issues and what's most pressing for you and what might be appropriate in your context. So the first exercise that I'm hoping you can do on your own at home in your own time is this idea of an institutional critical marketing, where we hijack the idea of marketing in order to say a very deep hitting and critical things about ourselves in order to rethink our museums or our cultural institutions. So if we take Nordnorsk Kunstmuseum, for example, what I'm suggesting is that you get an image of your building, of your institution, and you can work very low tech and hands-on with tracing paper and tape and some markers, for example, and imagine sort of super graphic, super size marketing slogans that could start happening to your institution to talk about the things that maybe you are not talking about with your colleagues and your public. So here's an example of what that might look like in a sort of cleaned up Photoshop version, that we could speak about this institution, for example, being an institution of assimilation, colonization, and Norwegianization for 30 years, and really making that visible on the facade. Exercise number 2, again, looking at your own institution, but in a text versus a visual exercise, and looking at mandates or mission statements. Again, you can find a mission statement, find what your institution says it works with, and get critical about this. Again, get out some tracing paper, do an overlay, and what happens when we reveal, when we try to work with that which is missing, that which is omitted or excluded, and what might we then generate in place of that. So here, I think these type of quick exercises can be very powerful tools to reveal the ways in which things like mission statements really do have impact on what our institutions are or might otherwise be. So building on that, and you've seen I've worked with logos in terms of the museum, but also sometimes it's helpful to externalize. So a logo hacking exercise that I would encourage you guys to do, what happens, and focus, ideally focus on institutions of power. So your institution might not be one of the most powerful in your community or your country. So for example, focus at a national level. So here's a quick exercise in terms of rethinking a national museum in the Norwegian context. So the National Museum for Art, Architecture and Design, what happens when we reimagine it as an institution that is now radically open to the indigenous. So this word duolji, which is the Sami word for something that translates very roughly as craft. Suddenly, the indigenous is no longer peripheral or excluded to the national. It's an integral part of that institution's identity. A similar thing for you guys out there that might be from the non-museum world, the Norwegian opera and ballet getting remade as the Norwegian opera, ballet, and joik. And joik, like the word duolji, being a Sami practice of music or singing. And a final exercise here is the idea then of the total takeover as a speculative, fictive project. Here, I'm again externalizing. You could do this on your own institution or another institution to think really critically about what institutions do we have these days and what might we otherwise have, something totally different. So here's an image of the National Gallery in Oslo, in the capital of Norway. And I recently did a sort of version 2.0 of the Sami Art Museum project, where I reimagined the National Gallery as the Sami Art Museum in the heart of Norway's capital. And remaking this, it wasn't just about image making. This image was made in order to be published in a national newspaper, which indeed we did manage to succeed and get published. And that's when the idea of the rapid prototype or the radical prototype and what it might start doing out there in the world becomes very interesting, because this, of course, is an image and a text that not only sort of talks about a potential future, but starts creating a possible future, particularly in a digital space. So the keen-eyed of you out there will see that in a Google search now, for example, for Nasjonalgalleri or National Gallery in a Norwegian context, the sort of fictive alternative reality version of the Sami Art Museum is already living a life of its own out there. So I'm going to stop it there. That was enough from me, I think. And thanks so much for listening in. And I'm hoping for some questions and a discussion.